The candles at Lord Marfield's table had been burning for 20 minutes when someone asked Miss Vivienne Ashdale what she could do. The question was polite, the way all questions at that table were polite, shaped to cause no offense and invite no serious answer. Vivienne set down her spoon and said, without flourish, that she spoke 12 languages. The table went quiet in the particular way that expensive rooms go quiet when something unexpected has been said. Then Miss Helena Forsyth, seated to the right of Gideon Ashworth, Marquess of Caverleigh, laughed, not cruelly, not even unkindly, but with the light, practiced ease of a woman who has learned that a small laugh at the right moment requires no justification and leaves no mark. She said it must be terribly useful in the market. The table redistributed its attention the way water finds a new level, and the conversation moved on. Gideon reached for his wine glass. He did not look at Vivienne. He did not correct Helena. He simply reached for his glass, and the moment closed over itself like still water over a dropped stone. And Vivienne picked up her spoon again, and set it down again, and folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing for the remainder of dinner, what no one at that table knew. What Vivienne had not said and would not say, because she had no rank that gave her the right to say it, was that she had spent the previous 3 weeks reading the Prussian treaty that Gideon's office had been unable to close. She had read it in 4 languages. She had annotated it in 4 more. She had identified, in the 3rd week, that the clause blocking the negotiations had not been lost in translation by accident or incompetence. It had been rendered incorrectly by a man who stood to profit from its failure. She had circled the relevant passage in red ink and written, in the margin, a single German word that translated precisely as deliberate. She knew all of this. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she said nothing, because she was a companion, and companions do not interrupt dinner with treaty law. The evening continued. Lord Marfield made a toast. Lady Marfield admired Helena's dress, which was the color of winter roses and had clearly cost more than Vivienne earned in 3 months. Helena accepted the compliment with the same practiced grace she had used for the laugh, and glanced once at Vivienne across the table. Not cruelly, not even deliberately. Simply the way a woman glances at a piece of furniture that is taking up more space than it ought. Gideon said very little. He was a man who conserved speech the way some men conserved money, spending it only when the return was reliable. He answered Lord Marfield's questions about the Prussian delegation with 3 sentences that revealed nothing and satisfied the room completely. He was, Vivienne noted, very good at that. He had the particular skill of men who have spent years in rooms where information is currency, the skill of appearing to give while giving nothing at all. She watched him for the rest of dinner the way she had been trained, from childhood, to watch everything, without appearing to watch. Her father had called it the interpreter's eye. You are not in the room, Vivienne. You are the room. You take everything in, and you give nothing back until it is asked of you, and then you give only what was asked, and not 1 word more. She had been giving only what was asked for 3 years. The dinner ended. The guests moved to the drawing room. Vivienne made her excuses to Lady Marfield, a headache, quietly stated, and went upstairs and closed the door of her room, and stood in the dark for a moment, with her back against the door and her eyes closed. Then she crossed to the writing desk, moved aside the stack of Lady Marfield's social correspondence she had been sorting, and retrieved from beneath it a leather case. She unlatched the case, drew out the document inside, and set it on the desk under the lamp. It was 37 pages. The margins were dense with her handwriting. Pencil notations in German, Polish, French and English, cross-referencing the official English text against the Prussian original and 2 intermediate translations she had obtained through her contact at the Foreign Office's document room. A young clerk named Phelps, who believed he was helping a retired linguist named Mr. A. Ashdale, and had no reason to think otherwise. 3 years of anonymity had made her careful about names. She turned to page 14. Clause 7. The red circle was still there, and the single German word in the margin, and beneath it, in her smallest hand, the full chain of reasoning she had assembled over 11 days. The original Prussian text, the correct English rendering, Fenton's published translation, and the specific commercial arrangement, a shipping consortium operating out of Hamburg, in which Mr. Fenton held a documented interest and which would benefit substantially if the treaty's 3rd article were delayed past the winter session. She read it through again from the beginning. Not because she had forgotten anything, she forgot very little, but because she needed to be certain. She needed to be certain that she had not made an error, that the conclusion she had reached was the only conclusion the evidence supported, that she was not about to do something irreversible based on a mistake. She was not mistaken. She closed the document. She placed it back in the case and latched it. She set the case beside the writing desk where she would be able to reach it in the morning. And she went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and thought about the sound of Helena Forsyth's laugh, that small, clean, social sound, so light it left no bruise, and thought about the way Gideon Ashworth had reached for his wine glass without looking at her, and thought about her father, who had spent 40 years giving his best work to men who signed their names to it, and who had died in a rented room in Vienna with a dictionary open on his chest and no pension and no monument. She thought about all of this, and then she stopped thinking about it and went to sleep. He came the next morning before 10. Vivienne was in the anteroom sorting Lady Marfield's correspondence when Hobbs, the footman, appeared in the doorway and said that the Marquess of Caverleigh was in the hall and wished to know if Miss Ashdale was available to speak. He had not sent a card. He had not written ahead. He was simply there, in the hall, at 20 minutes before 10, which told her something about the state of the negotiations that his expression, when she came downstairs, confirmed entirely. He was standing by the window with his hat in his hand, and he looked like a man who had not slept well, which Vivienne found privately appropriate. "Miss Ashdale," he said, "I will not take much of your time. I have a matter of some urgency related to the Prussian treaty, and I have been told, by a source I consider reliable, that you have done translation work for the Foreign Office." "I have," Vivienne said. She did not sit. Neither did he. "The matter concerns a specific clause," he said. "Clause 7 of the 3rd article. My current interpreter has not been able to resolve the difficulty, and the delegation returns to Berlin in 11 days. "What are the terms?" Vivienne asked. He named a fee. It was not a courtesy figure. It was the kind of number that acknowledged the work was real and the expertise was genuine, and Vivienne recognized it immediately as the number a man names when he cannot afford to be wrong again. "Accepted," she said. He nodded. He reached into his coat and produced a document, a folded copy of the treaty, the official English text, and held it out to her. She stepped forward to take it, and their fingers touched on the paper, briefly, and he went still for a fraction of a second before he released it. Neither of them mentioned the previous evening. "The Prussian lead negotiator," Vivienne said, looking at the document rather than at him. "Baron von Kessler." What do you know of his background before the current appointment? Career diplomat, Gideon said. 20 years in the Prussian foreign ministry, trained in Vienna. Known to be methodical and difficult to move once he has taken a position. And before Vienna? Vivienne asked. I don't have that detail immediately to hand. He spent 7 years at the University of Breslau, Vivienne said. He published 3 papers on treaty interpretation between 1801 and 1808. My father corresponded with him for most of that decade. They met in person twice, once in Dresden, once in London in 1811, when my father was still with the Foreign Office. She looked up. I thought you should know that before we begin. Gideon was very still. How long have you known that? He asked. Since the first week of October, Vivienne said, when Phelps sent me the delegation list. Gideon looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Not quite embarrassment, not quite calculation. Something that moved between the two. Then he put his hat back on. I will send the full session documents to you this afternoon, he said. We begin tomorrow. He left. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame and turned back. And for a moment, Vivienne thought he was going to say something about the dinner. He did not. He nodded once, briefly, and went out. And the door closed behind him. And Vivienne stood in the anteroom with the treaty document in her hands and the morning light coming through the window, and allowed herself, for exactly 3 seconds, to feel something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite anger, and was probably closer to resolve. Then she went back to Lady Marfield's correspondence. The treaty room was on the 2nd floor of a building near Whitehall that smelled of beeswax and old paper and the particular damp that settles into London stone in November. There was a long table, 8 chairs on each side, a fireplace that produced more smoke than heat, and 3 windows that looked onto a courtyard where pigeons congregated with an air of permanent disapproval. The first session convened at 9 in the morning. Vivienne arrived before the Prussians and took the chair second from the end on the English side, which placed her beside Gideon's senior assistant, a Mr. Cartwright, who looked at her with an expression of polite bewilderment and said nothing. Gideon arrived 3 minutes later, glanced at her position, and sat at the head of the table without comment. Baron von Kessler entered with 4 attachés, surveyed the room, and stopped. He was a tall man, perhaps 60, with white hair and the kind of face that has spent decades listening carefully and revealing nothing. He looked at Vivienne, and something shifted in his expression. A recognition, quiet and complete, like a man who has found a word he had almost forgotten. He crossed the room and bowed to her, not to Gideon. Miss Ashdale, he said in German, you have your father's eyes. I would have known you anywhere. Baron von Kessler, Vivienne said in German. He spoke of you often. I am very glad to meet you. Gideon, seated at the head of the table, watched this exchange without moving. He filed it. Vivienne could see him filing it, the way a careful man files a piece of information he does not yet know how to use. The session began. Mr. Fenton, the official interpreter, sat to Gideon's left and translated with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has never been seriously questioned. Vivienne listened. She took notes. She did not interrupt. By the end of the first hour, she had identified 3 places where Fenton's rendering of the Prussian text was imprecise. Not wrong enough to object to directly, but tilted, the way a frame tilts on a wall when someone has moved it a fraction of an inch. Not enough to notice unless you are looking. She noted each instance in the margin of her copy and said nothing. In the second hour, Von Kessler raised an objection, in German, about the wording of the third article. Fenton began to translate. Vivienne, without raising her voice, said, "The Baron says the word used in the Prussian original is Vereinbarung, which is closer to arrangement than to agreement. The distinction matters because agreement implies mutual consent to the terms as stated, while arrangement implies the terms are subject to further negotiation." She said this to Gideon, quietly and directly, before Fenton had finished his sentence. Fenton stopped. Gideon looked at Vivienne. Then he looked at von Kessler. "Is that the distinction you are drawing, Baron?" he asked. Von Kessler nodded once, with the expression of a man who has been waiting 3 weeks for someone to ask that question. The session continued. By the end of it, Gideon had stopped completing Fenton's translations mid-sentence. The habit he had developed, Vivienne noticed, of adding a word or clarification before Fenton had finished, which was the habit of a man who had begun, unconsciously, to trust the translation less than he trusted his own instinct. He stopped doing it. He waited. He listened to Vivienne instead. The second session, the following day, was faster. Von Kessler stood when Vivienne entered the room, and 2 of his attachés exchanged a look across the table that Vivienne noted without appearing to note. By the third session, Gideon had stopped directing his clarifying questions to Cartwright and was directing them at Vivienne instead, which Cartwright bore with the dignified resignation of a man who has understood that the situation has changed and has decided to adjust rather than object. In the third session, a Prussian attaché, the one Vivienne had privately designated number 2, for reasons she had not yet shared, spoke across her twice in the same minute while she was in the middle of a rendering. He did not do it loudly or rudely. He simply spoke as though she had not begun, the way men speak across women in rooms where women are not expected to hold the floor. Gideon, without a word, without any visible deliberation, moved his chair. He shifted it perhaps 8 inches to the left, which placed him squarely between Vivienne and the attaché. And he did not move it back for the remainder of the session, and the attaché did not speak across her again. Vivienne registered this. She registered it the way she registered everything, completely and without expression. But that evening, walking back through the Whitehall corridor, she was aware of a change in the quality of the air between them. Something that had not been there at the start of the week, something that had no name in any of the 12 languages she spoke. The fourth session ran until past midnight. This was not planned. The Prussian attachés had raised a new objection in the afternoon, a technical matter involving the tariff schedule appended to the third article. And the discussion had expanded the way treaty discussions expand when both sides are simultaneously trying to close and trying to protect, until the candles in the wall sconces had burned down twice and the footman had been sent twice for fresh ones. Vivienne had been providing simultaneous interpretation for 4 hours. This was not the kind of work that looks impressive from the outside. It is quiet, concentrated, almost still, a person listening and speaking at the same moment, carrying 2 conversations at once without losing the thread of either. It is the kind of work that takes everything. By the 3rd hour, her hand on the table was visibly tense. The tendons in her wrist pronounced against her skin, her fingers pressed flat against the wood, as though the table were the thing keeping her anchored. Gideon reached across and laid his hand briefly over hers. Not a grasp, not a gesture, just the weight of his palm, for perhaps 4 seconds, and then he removed it before she could respond. The pressure said, simply and without words, "You have it. Hold on." She did not lose a single word. When the session finally broke, Von Kessler rising with the deliberate movements of a man who has been sitting too long and is too disciplined to show it. The room emptied by degrees, the attachés collecting their papers, Fenton disappearing with his coat already on, Cartwright murmuring something to a secretary near the door. Gideon walked beside Vivienne in the corridor. Von Kessler has been blocking these sessions for 3 weeks, he said, because no one on the English side has addressed him in the language in which he trusts himself. I know, Vivienne said. He trusted your father, Gideon said. Yes, she said quietly. How long have you known that this was the reason for the delay? Since the first session, Vivienne said. When he stood. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Their footsteps on the stone floor were the only sound in the corridor. There is something else, Vivienne said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The 2 attachés on the left side of the table, the ones who sit at positions 4 and 6. They have been coordinating their objections. Not through speech. They use a very small system of hand signals, which I believe they developed for use in crowded rooms where they cannot be overheard. She paused. The attaché at position 2 is genuinely uncommitted. He objects on principle and not on instruction. The one at position 7 reports directly to Fenton. Gideon stopped moving entirely. You have been reading their lips, he said. It was not quite a question. For 4 sessions, Vivienne said. My father taught me. He said the most important conversation in a negotiation is always the one that isn't meant to be heard. Gideon stood in the corridor and looked at her, and Vivienne looked back. And the silence between them was not the silence of the dinner table. It was not the silence of a woman who has been dismissed. It was the silence of 2 people who have suddenly understood where they are. Go home, he said finally. Sleep. We have tomorrow. She went. The 5th session convened at 10 in the morning, and by 11 it had become something else entirely. Fenton had prepared a clean version of the treaty text, a consolidated draft incorporating all agreed amendments, and the intention was to enter it into the official record as the basis for the final signature session. He presented it with the smooth efficiency of a man who has done this before. The pages arranged, the secretaries ready, Von Kessler's senior attaché reaching for his pen. Vivienne looked at the document in front of her. Clause 7 was there. The red circle existed only in her own copy, at home in the leather case. But the clause was there, and Fenton's rendering of it was there. And the specific word he had chosen, forfeiture rather than relinquishment, was there, carrying its precise, devastating difference in implication, the difference between a party that surrenders something under penalty and a party that voluntarily cedes it under agreed terms, a difference that would, over the life of the treaty, shift the entire burden of the shipping arrangement onto the English side and away from the Hamburg consortium in which Fenton held his interest. The attaché's pen touched the paper. Stop, Vivienne said. The room went still. She turned to Von Kessler. She did not speak in English. She did not speak in German. She spoke in Polish, quietly, directly, the way her father had taught her to speak when she needed a man to truly hear her. And she named the clause, and she named the word, and she named what the word meant and what it was supposed to mean and what the difference would cost, and she named the Hamburg consortium, and she named Fenton's documented interest in it. And she said all of this in perhaps 90 seconds, in a language that no one else in the room understood. Von Kessler's hand came up. The attaché set down his pen. The session collapsed in the way that formal proceedings collapse when a truth enters the room that cannot be contained. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, irreversible certainty of a structure that has lost its load-bearing wall. Fenton went pale. Cartwright asked 3 questions in rapid succession, each one more urgent than the last. Von Kessler addressed the room in German, formally and at length, and Vivienne translated every word, and by the time she had finished, 2 of the Foreign Office secretaries were already at the door. Fenton left before he was asked to. The corridor outside the treaty room was empty and cold, and Vivienne stood in it alone, and her body did what bodies do when they have been holding something for a very long time and have finally been allowed to set it down. She did not cry. She stood with her back against the wall and shook, a fine, involuntary trembling from her shoulders to her hands, the kind that has nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the fact that she had just done the thing she had been waiting 3 years to do. And it was over. And she was still standing, and she did not quite know what to do with that. She heard footsteps. Gideon came out of the treaty room and stopped when he saw her. He did not speak. He crossed the corridor and stood in front of her, perhaps 2 feet away, and waited. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or explanation, or the kind of careful, measured words men use when they do not know what else to do. He simply stood there and waited, and the waiting itself was the thing. The acknowledgement that she was allowed to take up this much space, to shake in this corridor for as long as she needed, without being managed or redirected or told that everything was fine. Gradually, the trembling stopped. When she was still, he said, "I heard you." 2 words. She looked at him. He meant them. She could see that he meant them, not just in the way that men mean things when they are grateful, but in the way that a person means something when they understand, for the first time, what they were not hearing before. Something shifted between them in that corridor, in the cold, with the sound of raised voices still audible through the treaty room door. It shifted the way a compass shifts when it finds north, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, but with the particular, irreversible certainty of a thing that has found its proper direction. Helena arrived the following afternoon. She came without announcement, which was her right as Gideon's fiancée, and she came to the Foreign Office corridor rather than to the Marfield house, which told Vivienne that someone had told her where to look. She appeared in the doorway of the side room where Vivienne and Gideon were working, and she took in the scene. The 2 of them at the long table, documents spread between them, speaking in rapid German, Gideon's coat over the back of his chair and his cuffs turned up, and Vivienne's annotated copy of the treaty open between them like a map. And something moved across Helena's face that she controlled almost immediately. Almost. 2 Foreign Office secretaries were in the corridor, visible through the open door. Helena's voice, when she spoke, was pitched to carry. "I had wondered," she said, "whether what I was told was an exaggeration. It appears it was not." She directed this at Gideon, not at Vivienne. "A companion is not an interpreter, Gideon. I think you know that. I think you also know that women who speak too many languages generally learn them to attract attention, and that this," she gestured at the room, the documents, the 2 of them, "is a performance, not a professional arrangement." Gideon opened his mouth. Vivienne spoke first. "Miss Forsyth," she said. She kept her voice even and her hands flat on the table. "The clause that has blocked these negotiations for 3 weeks is Clause 7 of the 3rd article. The specific mistranslation is the word forfeiture, used in place of relinquishment. The man who made that choice is Mr. Fenton, your fiancé's appointed interpreter, who holds a financial interest in the Hamburg shipping consortium that benefits directly from the treaty's delay. I identified all 3 of those facts before the soup was cleared 3 nights ago at Lord Marfield's table, while you were explaining that 12 languages are useful in the market." She paused. "I did not say anything then, because I had no rank that gave me the right to say it. I have since been given that rank, so I am saying it now." Helena did not answer. The two secretaries in the corridor were very still. "I suggest," Vivienne said, "that you speak to Lord Marfield's solicitor about the timing of your next social engagement. I will be occupied here for the remainder of the week." Helena left. She did not slam the door. She was too well trained for that. But the quality of her departure, the precise, contained fury of it, was in some ways louder than any sound. Gideon looked at Vivienne. "You knew all of that at dinner," he said. "Yes," Vivienne said. "And you said nothing." "You did not ask me," Vivienne said. "And your fiancé had just suggested that my education was suited to the purchase of vegetables." He had no answer to that. She watched him absorb it, watched the implications of it move through him, what it meant that she had been sitting at that table with the solution in her hands, and he had not thought to ask, had not imagined there was anything to ask, had looked at her and seen a companion and nothing more. Within an hour, the word had reached the Foreign Secretary. Within 2 hours, Fenton had been formally removed from the commission. By the following morning, Vivienne's name, her full name, Miss Vivienne Ashdale, daughter of Sir Edmund Ashdale of the Foreign Office, appeared on the official commission document as the treaty's interpreter of record. Helena's letter arrived 3 days later. It was addressed to Gideon and copied to 3 women whose social correspondence reached every drawing room in London. And it called him faithless, and called Vivienne a social climber who had manufactured a diplomatic crisis for the purpose of personal advancement. And it was written in the careful, precise style of a woman who knows exactly how much damage a well-placed letter can do. Vivienne read about the letter in the morning paper, not from Gideon. She read it over her tea in Lady Marfield's breakfast room, while Lady Marfield made sympathetic sounds from behind her own paper and said that some women were simply not equal to disappointment. Vivienne set down her cup and went upstairs and sat at the writing desk for 10 minutes, looking at the wall. Then she put on her coat and went to the treaty room. Gideon was already there when she arrived. He was at the window, looking out at the courtyard, and he turned when she came in, and she could see that he had not slept, not last night, and possibly not the night before. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. "You should have said something at dinner," she said. 3 nights ago when Helena laughed. "You should have said something then." "Yes," he said, "just that." "If you fail to say something again in a situation of that kind," Vivienne said, "I will not be here to correct the treaty the next time." "Understood," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the treaty draft and smoothed the pages flat. The tariff schedule in the appendix still has 3 errors that need addressing before the signature session. Shall we begin? They began. That evening, the last evening before the signature session, Gideon did not go home when the work was finished. He stayed, and Vivienne stayed, and the room grew quiet around them, and the last of the secretaries gathered his papers and left. And then there were only the 2 of them, and the lamp, and the sound of the fire. Gideon said, "I ended the engagement, not because of the treaty, not because Helena wrote letters." Vivienne waited. "I stayed silent at that dinner," he said, "because I had ordered the world in a particular way, and in that ordering, you were in a category that did not require my attention. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I reached for my wine glass because it was easier than looking at you." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "There is a man named Rawlings. He was my closest colleague in the peninsula. He died in 1812 because a message was mistranslated in the field. An order that arrived saying hold position when the original had said advance. He held. The position was overrun. I have carried that since then, and I chose Fenton because Fenton was qualified on paper and I did not look more carefully. And trusting Fenton without question was the same error that killed Rawlings. And I knew it the moment you named the clause in that room. And I have not been able to think about anything else since. The room was very quiet. I am telling you this, Gideon said, because you deserve to know why this treaty matters to me beyond the political, and because I have spent 6 days watching you do, without recognition, what Rawlings would have called the most important work in the room. And I do not want to be the kind of man who watches that and says nothing. Not again. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had given 40 years to men who signed their names to his work. She thought about 3 years of short sentences and retained opinions and anonymous honoraria. She thought about the red circle on page 14 and the single German word in the margin, and the 11 days she had spent building a case she had no rank to present. She stood up, and she leaned across the corner of the table, and she kissed him, once, direct and brief and entirely deliberate, the way she did everything. His hand came up to her arm and stayed there for a moment, and she straightened, and she picked up the treaty draft, and she walked back toward the door of the treaty room without turning around. "Tomorrow," she said from the doorway, "we finish it." The signature session convened at 2 in the afternoon with both full delegations present, the Foreign Secretary's representative at the head of the table, and a secretary positioned at each end to produce the official record. The room was more crowded than it had been at any previous session. Additional attachés on the Prussian side, 2 additional Foreign Office officials, and, seated against the wall in the observer's chair with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of moves, Mr. Fenton. Vivienne took her place at the table. Her name was on the commission document in front of the secretary. She had read it that morning, and she had allowed herself to read it twice, and then she had set it down and drunk her tea. The session opened. The consolidated treaty text was presented. The tariff schedule was confirmed. The 3rd article was read aloud, in English and in German, and Vivienne rendered each passage, and the room moved forward with the quiet, purposeful momentum of a thing that has been too long delayed and is finally, at last, arriving. Then von Kessler raised his hand. He spoke in Polish. The room went still. Polish was not one of the session languages. It had not been used in any previous session. Every head turned toward Fenton, because Fenton was the appointed interpreter, and Fenton was in the room, and if anyone was going to address von Kessler's objection, it should be Fenton. Fenton did not move. He sat in his observer's chair against the wall and looked at the table in front of him. And he did not move, because he did not speak Polish. And everyone in the room who mattered now knew that the man who had been translating this treaty for 3 weeks had been doing so with a specific and deliberate gap in what he chose to render. Vivienne said, "Baron von Kessler raises a concern about the implementation timeline in the 2nd appendix. He notes that the dates as stated assume Prussian ratification within 30 days, which is constitutionally impossible under the current Prussian parliamentary calendar. The minimum ratification period is 45 days. He proposes an amendment to read within 60 days of the date of signature, which gives both parties adequate room and does not alter the substance of the agreement." She said this in English. Then she turned to von Kessler and said it in German, so that his attachés could confirm it. Then she addressed von Kessler directly in Polish and said, "Is that what you wish to say, sir?" Von Kessler said in Polish, "That is exactly what I wish to say." Your father would be very proud." Vivienne translated this for the room. The Foreign Secretary's representative looked at the amendment. He looked at Gideon. Gideon nodded. The amendment was entered. Von Kessler stood. He stood not toward the head of the table, not toward the Foreign Secretary's representative, not toward Gideon. He stood toward Vivienne, and he bowed, a formal, deliberate bow, the kind that means something. And he said in German, loud enough for every person in the room to hear, "The English side has finally sent someone worth speaking to." The room went very quiet. Gideon picked up his pen. He did not reach for the treaty text. He reached for the official commission document, the one that listed the names of the English delegation's appointed representatives. And he wrote, in the space below the last entry, in a clear and unhurried hand, "Miss Vivienne Ashdale, interpreter of record, by appointment of the Marquess of Caverleigh." He pushed the document across the table to her before the secretary could speak, before anyone could ask whether this was the proper procedure, before the moment could be managed or delayed or redirected. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down in front of her on the English side of the table, where it belonged. The treaty was signed. Lord Marfield's dining room looked different 6 days later. The table was the same table, the candles were the same candles, the silver was the same silver. But the room looked different, because the woman seated at it was different, not in dress, not in manner, but in the particular quality of her presence, the way a room changes when the person in it has stopped making themselves smaller. Vivienne's name was on the treaty record. This was not a rumor or a social whisper. It was a documented fact, entered into the Foreign Office's official commission register, and it had been reported in 2 newspapers. And von Kessler had mentioned it in his formal communication to the Prussian Foreign Ministry. And Lord Marfield had read all of this and had invited her to the closing dinner, not as Lady Marfield's companion, but as a guest of distinction, and had seated her accordingly. Gideon was beside her. This was also documented, in the sense that everyone in the room could see it and would remember it, which in the social arithmetic of 1820 was a form of declaration. Von Kessler gave a toast. He gave it in German, as he gave everything, precisely at length, with the particular warmth of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something, and is glad, finally, to be able to say it. He toasted the treaty, and he toasted the English Foreign Office, and he toasted the memory of Sir Edmund Ashdale, and he toasted his daughter, whom he called, in German, the finest interpreter he had encountered in 30 years of diplomatic service. The table looked at Gideon, because Gideon was the Marquess and the head of the English delegation and the person who was supposed to translate for the benefit of the guests who did not speak German. Gideon translated, he did it without being asked, which Vivienne noted. He did it with the slightly effortful concentration of a man who reads a language better than he speaks it. And he got the substance right and the grammar approximately right. And the final phrase, the compliment about Sir Edmund, he rendered as a man of considerable learning, which was accurate but missed the warmth entirely. He said a man whose love for language was a gift to everyone who knew him. Vivienne said in a low voice, close enough that only Gideon could hear her. He looked at her. That is significantly better, he said. It is what he said, Vivienne said. I know, Gideon said. I was attempting to be modest on your father's behalf. He would not have wanted that, Vivienne said. He was not a modest man. Gideon laughed. It was a real laugh, not the careful social laugh of a man in a room where laughter must be managed, but the laugh of a person who has been genuinely surprised by something and has not thought to conceal it. The table looked at him with mild astonishment. because the Marquess of Caverleigh was not a man who laughed at dinner. And something about the sound of it made the room warmer. Vivienne smiled. It was a smile no one at that table had seen on her before. Not the composed, polite expression she wore as a companion, not the focused attention she wore in the treaty room, but something else entirely. Something that belonged to her, and that she had apparently decided tonight to allow to be visible. The dinner continued. The toast was drunk. Von Kessler shook Gideon's hand and kissed Vivienne's, and said something in Polish that made her laugh. And the other guests watched this with the particular fascination of people who are witnessing something they can't quite categorize but recognize as significant. Later, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low and the Marfield house had settled into its nighttime quiet, the front door opened and closed, and two people stood on the step in the cold November air, and the door closed behind them. What they said to each other, no one else heard. What was known, what would be entered in its own time into the record of things that are true and lasting and worth the wait, was that the woman who had folded her hands in her lap 6 days ago and said nothing had stopped making herself small, that the man beside her had learned, at some cost to himself, what it meant to hear someone, that the treaty had been signed, that her name was on it, and that the lamp in the upstairs window of the Marfield house burned on for a very long time after the front door closed, because there was still, it seemed, a great deal left to say.